Greetings and welcome to another edition of Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. So, what we're going to be talking about today is how do you do enrichment in a virtual setting? A lot of schools find themselves either in a hybrid or fully in a virtual setting. And the question becomes then how do you challenge students that are able to handle that challenge? How do you enrich them? How do you, meet their needs, just like you would meet the needs of kids at the other end of the spectrum? So I'm going to give you 4 strategies today that you can consider when it comes to enriching kids in a virtual setting. The first of these is providing options or choice for students. So when you are giving students assignments in a virtual setting, are there opportunities for them to make choices? And the choices can come in several things. It could be in the way that they're, approaching it, or what it is, how they're going to learn about what you've asked them to learn. So it doesn't have to be so prescribed necessarily. You can say, "I want you to learn about this. You have this much amount of time to do it," and then allow the student to figure out themselves how to do that. And that's going to be doing a couple of things. It's going to be showing them how to learn for themselves. It's going to be teaching them independence and all those executive functioning skills that are very valuable for students to have. Another way you could have choices is in the assessments that they take. So how will students show you what they mastered? There are all sorts of possibilities in a virtual environment. They could make a Flipgrid video. They could write something in a Google Doc. They could record something. They could make a video with graphics and things of that nature. So there's lots of opportunities in a virtual setting. It doesn't have to be your traditional pencil to paper test that we typically give students. So consider some of these alternatives. What you see here is a menu board. So what you might do is when you ask students to show what they've learned, allow them to choose something from this menu board that they'd like to show you. It could be a PowerPoint presentation. It could be a podcast. There's all sorts of possibilities that you can use given the fact that you're in a virtual setting and technology is more prevalent than if you were in a regular ed classroom. There are other things that you can consider as options or choices, whether it be the way that they structure their day. So do they need to be in certain classrooms at certain times, or do you give them, learning objectives at the beginning of the day and then give them the chance to manage their time and prioritize and figure out how to do that? That is going to, again, build on their executive function skills, which is going to benefit them later on. Other choices that you might make is are they going to collaborate with someone or not? So, in a virtual setting, you can still collaborate with others using Word or, Google Docs, or having them call each other or use a Google Hangout or Meet where they can talk. So there's all sorts of possibilities when it comes to choices and options. The question becomes, how often are you giving students that choice or option, even when it comes to the content that they're learning? So are there things that they're interested in learning about, or something that is a tangent of something they're already learning about? So they're learning about landforms and they're really curious about volcanoes. So are you giving them the choice to go explore that information on volcanoes to where they can kind of satiate that curiosity that they have? So giving choices is always a really good option when it comes to enriching students. Another thing to consider is when you're giving students assignments, are you taking the ceiling off the learning? So what I mean by that is typically the way it works is in a traditional classroom is when a student does the work that they're asked to do, they're done. So they're going from point A to point B and they're accomplishing the task that you've asked them to do. This is not a terribly inspiring way to learn. So what if you instead took their learning and kind of opened it up so that they could explore a little bit? So for example, in a math class, instead of giving them 10 problems to work on, what if instead you ask them to explore other things, such as what are other questions that they could come up with that might be better? Or how would they rank these particular questions? Or are there multiple ways to answer the same question? There's all sorts of things you can do to kind of lift the ceiling on that, just answering 10 questions. So take this example right here. This is a worksheet that my daughter actually got in 7th grade from her science teacher, where they had to look at the global wind systems and answer these 10 questions. So when you read these questions, they are certainly asking students to provide information that they show that they have learned about these global wind systems. But there's definitely a ceiling on it because there's right and wrong answers, and it doesn't really allow them to go any further than what the question is asking. It's not really asking them to extend their thinking any. So what if you took the ceiling off of this particular worksheet? What if, as a 11th question, you ask them, you're starting from this point on the globe, so Honolulu, Hawaii, and you are having to go to Australia. What would that look like using these winds? What winds would benefit you? What winds might cause you problem? What parts might you have to use of a motor rather than just your sails? So there's all sorts of interesting uh, real world context that students can make to this particular lesson and what it is that they're learning. And it gives them a chance, to imagine what it would it be like, and they may have to do some follow up research to be able to answer some of those questions. But you're taking that ceiling off of the assignment and extending it beyond what was just asked. And that way, students are then extending their thinking and they're being enriched during that process. And when you're taking that ceiling off of the learning, the goal is not that they find a correct answer or the one right answer. The goal is that they think of all sorts of answers. And they're able to combine their own imagination and creativity and their own thought process to apply to a concept that you're trying to teach them. And this would definitely count as enrichment. So a third thing that you could do is you could give them enrichment opportunities. So what enrichment opportunities are just things outside of the curriculum where you're challenging them or giving them the opportunity to learn about something, either by posting a video or you're demonstrating something or you're sending them to a website that has some resources that allow them to do this. So this is, again, like I said, outside of the curriculum. So this is above and beyond. So an example of this would be if I'm teaching a math class to young students and I want them to understand numbers and how numbers work. I might have them do Sudoku puzzles. And that way they are learning how to use math, but they're also having fun while they're doing it. And this is going to enrich them. I might encourage them to play Monopoly if they're learning about the economy and how that works, because that's a game that puts that into play. So I throw these enrichment opportunities out there, not to be graded, not for me to check off that they did them, but just to allow students to make that choice for themselves, that this is something I want to learn more about. This is something I've always wanted to know how to do. Another example would be, like I could show them this video right here on how to work on a Rubik's Cube and then challenge them to try to solve the Rubik's Cube themselves. Does this have anything to do with what they're learning in your class? Probably not. Maybe with probability and math, or there could be some things that you could make links, but they would be weak links. But this is just giving them the opportunity to exercise their mind, to enrich them, and to allow them to try something that they maybe wouldn't have had the opportunity to try before had you not placed it in front of them. A lot of times, the way I like to do this is I like to issue them as a challenge. So I like to challenge students. I challenge you to do this. I'm not requiring that you do this. I just challenge you to do it. And then I'll engage in that myself, and I'll record myself, and I will put that on my virtual setting so that they can see what I did and how I failed and how it's okay to do that. And how what thought process I go through while I'm doing that. So, it is important to connect with students in a virtual setting. And this is one way you can do that, by kind of putting yourself out there and then challenging them to meet you where you're at. You don't have to reinvent the wheel with these enrichment challenges. There's plenty of stuff online that you can find, whether it be a YouTube video you can link them to, or it could be a website that shows them how to do something. But here's an example of what I provide for my teachers and students. Is I have this enrichment with a gifted guy where I have several videos that challenge kids to do things, whether it be solving puzzles, learning to play solitaire, finding a good book, how to cook something. And there are over 20 of these videos on this particular site. So if you're interested in just finding some so you don't have to create them yourselves, this is a resource that you could go to. And there are many other resources that you could go to as well. A fourth strategy that you consider when enriching your students is simply the level of thinking you're requiring students to do with the questions that you're asking. So whether this is a worksheet or an assignment they're working on, or some problems, or an assessment? Are the questions that you're asking requiring them to engage in a higher level of thinking? So what you see here is Bloom's taxonomy, and it has its lower levels of understanding and remembering and applying, and it has its higher levels of analyzing and evaluating and creating. So the question is, are you asking students to evaluate, create, and analyze very much, or are you only in the lower quadrant of this? And this is not to say that you shouldn't ask some lower level questions. You have to do that for understanding, to check things. But then are you asking the follow up questions that kind of lead up to that deeper thinking, to that enrichment that students have? And so, what this might look like on an assessment is you could scaffold this. So, you could have one question leading to another. So, here's an example right here. So, for this particular example, you might have had them read a passage and then had these questions that you wanted them to consider. A lot of these are lower level questions when you're starting out, such as how many political parties were there? They'd have to discern that through the text. Which of the four candidates received the most votes? Again, this is all information that they would comprehend from the passage. But you're leading up, you're scaffolding up until you eventually get to this big question, which is, why were Adams and Clay accused of making a corrupt bargain? And so that could be debated. And it could be, it is looking at it at a bigger picture or a bigger question. And even has a sentence starter there. Adams and Clay were accused of making corrupt bargain because, and then, so that's actually using stems to help you write your higher level questions. So this is a way that you could scaffold kids to get them to think at higher levels rather than just thinking within the vacuum of what they're learning, looking at the big picture, the context of what it is that they're learning and how that applies. So this would just be one example of how you could do that. Asking higher level questions, though, doesn't need to be just relegated to assessments. It can be in your bell ringers, it can be in your worksheets, it can be in your day to day activities, it can be in the conversations that you have with students. With in a virtual setting, it is important for you to have contact with students and to have meetings with them. So here's an example of morning meetings that you might have with students just to kind of touch base with them. And in these morning meetings, you can ask them higher level questions and you can see them here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but like you could ask them questions like, where would they like to travel to and for what purpose? So they can live like, since, vacations were shut down so much with COVID and everything. Should kids get rewarded for getting good grades? That could be a debate in itself. One of my favorite questions: why do they make pizzas round, cut them in triangles, and put them in square boxes? So there's lots of possibilities with those higher level questions, and just having conversations with students and connecting with them and seeing how they think can be very valuable. But it's going to enrich them. These higher level questions are going to cause them to think outside the box more so than if you make them think firmly inside the box. And so it's going to give them the opportunity to be challenged. It would be quite easy to hold those morning meetings in a Zoom chat room or in a Google Meet, where you're actually seeing students face to face and you're taking part in the discussion with them and making that connection with students. So there are four strategies that you can use to enrich students. Another one that I'll suggest that I'm not going to go into much detail is the use of project-based learning. I have a Todd Talk that covers that. You can see the address here that you can find that video, but this shows you how you can use project-based learning to challenge students. So it's another vehicle for you to challenge students in a virtual setting and what that might look like.